This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to take a look at effects that let you exchange control of permanents. While this kind of effect isn't nearly as powerful as a mind control effect, that is, an effect that lets you just steal an opposing permanent without giving your opponent anything in return, exchange effects often cost significantly less mana. Even if you do have to give your opponent something, this kind of effect can still be quite powerful, as they can allow you to give up something a lot less impressive than whatever you take from them. To be eligible for this list, a card had to allow you to exchange a permanent of yours with a permanent of your opponent's. In all, there are 37 cards with this kind of effect, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 effects that let you exchange permanents. At number 10, it's Role Reversal. For 2 blue and a red, this sorcery allows you to exchange control of 2 target permanents that share a type. It saw a bit of play in standard Jeskai decks, where it was at its best when combined with Fibblethip the Lost. Fibblethip delivers your value right away by drawing you a card, and when it gets targeted, it gets shuffled back into your library. This means if you use Role Reversal, you end up getting your opponent's best creature and they get nothing. Role Reversal hasn't seen any play since rotating out of standard. At number 9, it is Puks Mischief, which has the same score as Role Reversal, but a higher average finish, so I gave it the higher spot. For 3 generic and a blue, during your upkeep, this enchantment lets you exchange control of a non-land permanent you control and target non-land permanent opponent controls with an equal or lesser value. This repeatable exchange effect does try to make it so you can't pull off anything too insane with it because of the mana value restriction. It has gained both of its points in Legacy, with 2 separate top 8s 5 years apart from each other, and they both came in Enchantress decks, where 1 copy of Mischief is sometimes played to tutor up in specific situations. The sweetest thing the deck can do is give your opponent illusions of grandeur, effectively making Mischief into a donate effect. You get to gain all that life and then give grandeur to your opponent, and as soon as they can't pay the upkeep cost, they lose the game. The deck also uses Solitary Confinement, which is great for locking the game down, but sometimes you want to get rid of it because of its downside, and Puks Mischief lets you do that, effectively allowing you to donate it to your opponent when the downside really hurts them. The deck also uses symmetrical effects like Blood Moon and Moat, and giving those to your opponent isn't any different than you controlling them, so you can get back some nice value. Puks Mischief doesn't have any points since 2017. At number 8, it's Daring Thief. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a 2/3 with Inspired, which means something happens when it untaps. In this case, you get to exchange control of a target non-land permanent you control and target non-land permanent opponent controls that share a type. Daring Thief's points came in Theros Block Constructed, which featured a deck that was built to abuse Inspired. It looked to tap its creatures with Springleaf Drum and Triton Tactics. It also ran lots of creatures that gave you most of their value when they entered the battlefield, like Brain Maggot and Omen Speaker, so exchanging those for more powerful creatures was the game plan, but it never gained any points outside of Block Constructed. At number 7, it's Vidalcan Plotter. For 2 generic and a blue, the Plotter is a 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield, you exchange control of a land you control with a land your opponent controls. The Plotter has gained points as a sideboard card in Modern, where it's particularly effective against Tron decks. The decks it appears in can really abuse into the battlefield abilities too, with cards like Ephemerate and Soul Herder, which can easily allow you to assemble the Tron lands on your side of the battlefield. These decks did take a bit of a step back after Yorion got banned, and the Plotter hasn't gained any points since 2022. At number 6, it's Avarice Totem. It has the same total score as the Plotter, but a higher average finish. This is an artifact that costs 1 generic, and you can pay 5 generic to exchange control of it and target non-land permanent. Obviously enough, this means that once your opponent has it, they can exchange it right back. The Totem has gained all of its points in Legacy Cloud Post decks, which specialize in assembling a bunch of lands with the Locust type and producing insane amounts of mana. This means the deck is far more capable of activating the ability than its opponents, thanks to all that mana, but there is something else really silly you can do when you have a ton of mana. you can actually activate the ability twice, at which point it effectively becomes a 10 mana ability that lets you exchange any non-land permanent your opponent controls with any non-land permanent of yours. This is because the second activation resolves first, and you get your opponent's permanent in exchange for the totem. Then the first activation triggers, which you use to target your own permanent, that resolves and swaps your other permanent for the totem, so you get it back. That's pretty powerful if you have access to a ton of mana, but so far it doesn't have any points in 2023. At number 4, it's Confusion in the Ranks. This enchantment costs 3 generic and 2 red, and whenever an artifact, creature, or enchantment enters the battlefield, its controller chooses target permanent another player controls that shares a card type with it, and you exchange control of those 2 permanents. It does trigger off itself, so if your opponent has an enchantment, you get it right away. Losing Confusion doesn't really matter either because the effect is symmetrical. It's gained all of its points in the sideboard of Legacy Goblin decks. These decks make lots of Goblin tokens, so stealing opposing creatures is pretty easy. It's especially spicy against decks like Reanimator or other decks that like to cheat creatures into play, because exchanging some random Goblin for a huge creature feels pretty good. At number 4, it is Political Trickery. For 2 generic and a blue, it lets you exchange a land you control with a land your opponent controls. There were several very powerful lands in both Standard and Extended when Trickery was legal there, with Thawing Glaciers and Kildoran Outpost being the most notable examples. It was played as a sideboard card to bring in against opponents who were reliant on these powerful lands, and was especially nice against the Outpost, since if your opponent didn't get to reap the benefits from it, casting Trickery almost felt like casting a better version of Stone Rain, since they will have sacrificed a land to put it into play. Political Trickery gained all of its points in 1997, but there aren't exactly a ton of cards printed with this effect, so it isn't in any real danger of falling off this list either. At number 3, it is Sudden Substitution. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's an instant that exchanges control of target non-creature spell and target creature, then the new spell's controller can choose new targets for it. It also has Split Second, which means that as long as it's on the stack, players can't put anything else on the stack. In other words, it's uncounterable and your opponent can't respond to it either. It was printed in Commander 2019, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage. This is a bit different than the other cards on the list because 2 permanents aren't actually exchanged here. Instead, it's 1 permanent and 1 non-creature spell. While you might think this would primarily be used to give up a creature token to gain control of a super powerful spell, that isn't how it's been used in 60 card formats. Instead, it's played in Legacy Hivemind decks. This deck looks to cast a pact, like Slaughter Pact with Hivemind in play. All of the pacts make it so the person who resolves it has to pay mana on their next turn or lose the game, and if you have Hivemind in play, your opponent is forced to copy a pact when you cast it. Then they're going to be unable to pay the mana and they lose. Sudden Substitution gives the deck some redundancy because it also lets you force your opponent to cast a pact. Substitution looks likely to continue to gain points in Legacy going forward, but the top 2 cards on this list have way more points than everything else on it, and I can't imagine it will ever manage to catch either of them. At number 2, it's Gilded Drake. For 1 generic and a blue, the Drake is a 3/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you exchange control of it and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. It gets sacrificed if you don't make an exchange. Obviously, this is a pretty weird card, so it didn't see any play while it was in Standard, but it did see a lot of play in Extended sideboards. It was mostly relegated to sideboards because of the fact that a card like this isn't going to be very good against your typical creature deck. Generally, you're going to be getting a worse creature than the Drake. However, it is great against decks that go big with creatures. It saw some mainboard play as a one-of in Extended where it could be tutored up by Survival of the Fittest in situations where it was at its most powerful. It didn't see any play between 2005 and 2012, but since 2012 it's had a resurgence in Legacy where it's particularly powerful against decks that like to cheat creatures into play with Reanimation or especially Show and Tell. Show and Tell has both players put something into play, so if your opponent's putting Gristlebrand down, giving them your Gilded Drake in exchange feels pretty good. It's still seeing play in Legacy today. And at number 1, it's Oko, Thief of Crowns. For 1 generic, a green, and a blue, Oko is a 4 loyalty planeswalker, and he qualifies for this list because of his -5, which lets you exchange an artifact or creature you control and target creature an opponent controls with power 3 or less. He's also got a +2 that makes a food token and a +1 that turns an artifact creature into a vanilla 3/3. Oko does get most of his value out of that +2 and +1, and he's arguably the most powerful planeswalker ever printed, mostly because of those abilities. His +1 ability is really the most powerful one, as it just has a ton of powerful modes. You can use it, of course, to animate your food token or other artifacts, but you can also use it to substantially downgrade opposing creatures or artifacts by blanking them and turning them into 3/3s. The -5 does come up sometimes, as giving your opponent a food and getting a creature from your opponent is pretty good. It was clear very quickly that Oko Thief of Crowns was completely busted. He's been played in every single format. He was the most overpowered in Standard, where he was only legal for about 2 months and yet managed to gain 60 points in the format. The peak of his Standard dominance came between August 8th and 10th, when he was in 18 of the 24 decks to top 8 Premier events. He was ultimately banned out of Standard, Pioneer, Historic, Modern, Legacy, and even Brawl. These days, he's still legal in Vintage, and he's powerful enough to see regular play there. So despite all those bans, Oko will remain the #1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. So those are the top 10 cards that let you exchange permanents. If you're interested in catching your opponent off guard with this kind of wacky effect, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it to increase its reach. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly, and if you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.